Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, June 13th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 538 2024 election forecast. An election forecast that was released just a few days ago that many of you guys have been asking. With the very narrow advantage, the 50 to 49 advantage that President Biden holds today on 538, what does this actually translate to on the overall electoral map? Back in 2020, when 538 predicted that Joe Biden had a 90% chance at victory, it came with an electoral map of nearly 350 electoral votes in favor of Joe Biden. It had states like North Carolina and Florida in the Democratic Party's camp, and it actually totaled to just over 350 electoral votes for the Democratic nominee. But eventually that ended up being narrowed down to 306 electoral votes for Joe Biden compared to Donald Trump's 232. And so their eventual electoral map with a 90% rating for President Biden resulted in a map like this one. Now, it's interesting to see exactly what they predict for 2024, but the electoral map is equally as close as it might show when it comes down to the percentages. You can see this in our eventual forecast here, but taking a look at the 2024 electoral map will put it back into place and show you exactly how close this presidential race is. So let's go ahead and take a look. On your screen right now is the 2024 Electoral College map. This is with all of the states that have yet to be characterized for Republicans or Democrats. And like we do, we have 538 electoral votes that need to be characterized. Thus where the name 538 comes from. But the point here is that what we're focused on isn't really most of these states. In fact, just roughly 232 electoral votes are characterized outside of the safe rating, meaning that both parties are expected to win well over the majority of electoral votes here with ease, with no contention from either side of the aisle. This includes states like Washington and Oregon being overwhelmingly blue, and many states on the coast, and also Illinois in the Midwest. This also includes the District of Columbia and the state of Hawaii, and that brings President Biden to roughly 181 electoral votes. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has a good amount of states that he can characterize as safe in his column as well. States like West Virginia and Missouri and Louisiana that are overwhelmingly Republican. It brings Donald Trump to a whopping total of 125 electoral votes. That brings us down to 232 electoral votes that are pretty competitive, to say the least. Some of these states we are going to see tens of millions of dollars poured into them, and 538 has actually accounted for that. They've taken into account the money that both candidates have on hand. They've taken into account the polling that we see in some of these states. We've taken into account the number of field offices that we've seen and historical election results in 2020, 2022, and previous elections, all to build this collective indicator here that shows President Biden with the narrow upper hand over President Trump. Now, when it comes down to their overall forecast too, we can see that the map here is going to be exceptionally close. But their forecast doesn't work in perfect, right? What they find is that they do fluctuate. Sometimes they predict Biden has 299.5 electoral votes, other times 290 or 288, and it is very hard to find a combination such as that with an electoral map that looks like this. And so what we're focused on more specifically are these states, the more competitive ones, the 7 that are most important, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, and North Carolina, alongside some of the less competitive states, but are still not safe for the Republican Party end. And so, or Democratic Party, obviously. So let's go ahead and dive deep into some of these states and really just brush over some of the ones that are more lopsided in favor of either party. That way we can get through it a little bit quicker. So states like Iowa and Ohio are pretty solid for the Republican Party. Iowa, 85% chance of a Trump victory. Ohio, 79% chance of a Trump victory. I would say I even believe that they're a little bit higher than that, but that's where the forecast puts them. Texas, 79% chance. Florida, 74% chance. I'd go so far as to just make Florida at our discretion a likely red state. I really think that, we can brush over this. Don't need to spend much time talking about it. Moving over to the Democratic Party side, though, in a state like Virginia, that is a state that is likely blue. Minnesota and New Hampshire, both of which are technically lean blue. I'd argue that it is. Again, for the sake of this video, we're going to move it over into the safe, likely Democratic column, just because that's where we also expect it to see moving over in the next couple of weeks. Maine at large is going to be there. Maine's first is already there. Maine's second district is lean Democrat, so we'll keep that there. It's under 70%, so not too confident on using my discretion there. New Mexico and Colorado are safe. Likely blue. And so this brings us to an actual electoral map that is a little bit more, reasonable. An electoral map that is narrowing down where you will expect to see President Biden, President Trump in the 2024 election season. And so these are the states again: Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and surprisingly enough, Nebraska's 2nd District. Now, when I look at a map like this one, I see these 94 electoral votes as electoral votes that tell us where, not only, of course, what I've already mentioned about both candidates are going to be, but just generally speaking, what regions of the country are going to see the most attention. So not much in the middle of America. States extending even from Minnesota all the way to Utah really won't be touched. If anything, there'll be flyover states, and there might be infrequent fundraising efforts by President Biden or President Trump to visit these states, but outside of them, they won't receive that much attention. Now, when it comes down to Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, this is a region that is historically very competitive. Since 2016, Democrats have been fighting for this. Republicans have been really trying to do what they did in 2016 time and time again. And so these 3 states in specific are already a part of the Midwestern region. The RNC will be held in Milwaukee. The DNC will be held in Chicago. So this will be a high-profile region for the country. And 538 agrees. This is some of the most, prime targets here, and arguably will be seen as tipping point states, meaning that these will be the states that puts X candidate over the top, whether that be Trump or whether that be Biden. Now, the Sun Belt region is also going to receive a lot of attention, not much in the Northeast and not much on the West Coast. Nevada and Arizona, 2 Sun Belt states that are very important here. We expect them to receive attention based on 538's forecast, and same thing with North Carolina and Georgia. Another thing I would look at is also where you're going to see demographic groups specifically targeted. And so when it comes down to these 3 regions, they actually have very different and very distinct regional demographic breakdowns that go to show what campaigns are going to be fighting for. For instance, in the Rust Belt and Nebraska's 2nd, a very high white population combined with pockets of minority voters. In Milwaukee, in Philadelphia, in Detroit. Equally speaking, you are going to find that Arab American voters are going to be very important in states like Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, specifically in Dearborn, Michigan. So you're talking about one section of demographics in the country that will be very important. They will be important everywhere, but mostly important here. In North Carolina and Georgia, this is where you find that there is a significant amount of black voters. In fact, these 2 states serve to be as one of the few competitive states in the entire southern region, which often has the highest percent of black Americans in the country. And so North Carolina and Georgia, you'll be looking at the Atlanta metro area. You'll be looking at Raleigh, North Carolina. You are going to be looking at major cities where you find that the minority population, specifically black American population, is higher than in most other parts of the country. So North Carolina, Georgia, 2 states that are going to have this in one group, right? One section. You also have Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, which has, again, one section. Moving over to Nevada and Arizona, you are also going to find that these are states where you are going to find high levels of Latino voters, Hispanic voters in these states. And so, practically speaking, these campaigns are going to be about winning over different regions of the country. With that being taken into account, these states don't vote altogether in this forecast. As we know, this is a very competitive election. And what we know from our polls pretty much match exactly what we see here on the 538 forecast. That President Biden has seen major bleeding amongst Latino voters, amongst black voters, and it is not counteracted enough in some of these states that have higher minority populations, states like Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, because white voters don't make up as much of the percentage of voting blocks in these states. And so let's go ahead and look at it, but I want you to keep in mind as we look at some of these states and start to piece together, where is President Biden's pathway to victory? We're going to start off with the state that is most lopsided in favor of either political party, which actually isn't a state at all. It's Nebraska's 2nd District, which puts President Biden at a 67% chance of victory. Now, if you remember anything about the earlier prediction we saw in 538, the overall numbers here, every electoral vote matters. They're expecting the map to be very, very competitive, equally as competitive as a 50 to 49 advantage for President Biden. Nebraska's 2nd is an important piece of the puzzle there. We're brushing over it now, but I want you to keep that in mind. And so that brings us to 226 electoral votes for President Biden to 219 for Donald Trump, President Trump, former President Trump. North Carolina, 62% chance that he wins that. 16 electoral votes pumps him up slightly above President Biden, 235 electoral votes for President Trump. 77 electoral votes remain. Now again, in talking about piecing things together, there's one region of the country that has already started to move left. Another region of the country that has already started to move right. Now you can start to see exactly where this electoral map might end up. The next state that would be the most lopsided is actually in the state of Georgia, and then I would move over to a Rust Belt state. Georgia ends up being a state that President Trump is expected to win with a 59% chance of victory. Arguably not super strong, but certainly good for somebody who lost the state back in 2020. President Biden only won here by 0.23%, and any type of bleeding, I kid you not, any type of bleeding in this Atlanta metro area is enough to prevent President Biden from winning the election in Georgia. And so that goes to President Trump, 251 electoral votes in total. The next state that is the most lopsided is the state of Michigan. Surprisingly enough, Michigan is expected to go to President Biden by a larger margin than either Trump or Biden are expected in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada. Whether that's something that is rooted in whatever reason, I don't know, but I do believe that maybe there's some merit behind that. Michigan, however, is a state that President Biden is expected to win by a narrow margin, and that brings him to 241 electoral votes according to FiveThirtyEight. So again, very, very close race, but again, expected with the 50 to 49 advantage. Now, Nevada is the next state to go. President Trump has the identical margin in Michigan, except on the flip side, 56 to 44 in favor of Donald Trump, bringing him to 257 electoral votes. Every vote matters. These final three states were also grouped in together. Pennsylvania take out, swap it with Georgia. You have Wisconsin and Arizona, which both shared being in the top three of the most competitive races back in 2020. The only other state to join them was Georgia. The next state to join them would have been Pennsylvania. These states are routinely competitive. Wisconsin does have a competitive Senate race there. Arizona has a competitive Senate race there, and so does Pennsylvania. Georgia does not. Democrats are hoping that with a competitive Senate race, they're carried across the finish line in Arizona, in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. With the abortion referendum in Nevada and Arizona, Democrats are also hopeful. But we will see what the true direct impact is of that, because there might not be one at all. Regardless, though, President Biden at 241, President Trump at 257. The next three states we should characterize altogether are Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. States that President Trump has an advantage in Arizona, but President Biden holds an advantage in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Now, that 270 to 268 prediction from FiveThirtyEight is exactly what their electoral map ends up predicting. A very, very competitive race, and one that could only be the perfect ending in a way, right? Regardless of who you think should win. An extremely narrow race. Strip away the candidates. Strip away the parties. A 270 to 268, advantage, win, victory for one party nominee would be the perfect way to end an election like this one. Just keeping everything into context, this has been a three-time race for Donald Trump. This has been a very competitive race for both parties. And it is one that will come down to the wire, and this genuinely would be the most fitting, maybe not necessarily perfect, regardless of what side you're on, fitting way to end a presidential election like this one. And so 270 to 268 brings us to a point where FiveThirtyEight agrees with a lot of our understanding of the current state of the race, that the Rust Belt is the pathway to victory for President Biden, and it is no longer the Sun Belt. Despite the changing demographics and the major influxes of voters, which we'll talk about in a future video, because we do see that Democrats are outpacing Republicans in moving into states. It's about turning out your base and decreasing bleeding in some of these battleground states. Democrats have been able to decrease it in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, largely because of their high white population. That's fact. Democrats haven't been able to combat that in some other states where you have higher minority populations, like Arizona and Nevada. And that's being translated to our 2024 electoral map. This is a close race. No matter how you cut it, this is how we are going to see the race for quite some time. This 270 to 268 map here is one that I think takes many people by surprise, but isn't super surprising when you look at the polls, when you look at the enthusiasm, when you look at the campaign stops. And the Democratic campaign on Joe Biden's front does seem to be in part acknowledging this, right? Acknowledging that these are going to be the 7 most competitive races, the ad buys in these states, the increased ad buys in the Rust Belt region, the intentional use of Chicago as a Midwestern city hub to hold your convention. I mean, Democrats know what they're doing and know that this blue wall is required for President Biden to win the election. Because his pathway to victory with just Arizona and Georgia and Nevada just simply isn't enough. He needs the Rust Belt. And based on where he's spending money, and based on where the allocated resources are expected to go, this makes sense that this is the current state of the race. So in a 50 to 49 percentage advantage for President Biden, This is the electoral map we end up with. 270 for President Biden, 268 for President Trump, and everything comes down to either faithless electors or an electoral map that is going to give the narrowest victory in U.S. history to President Biden for 4 more years, at least according to 538. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.